Hello and good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our webinar today on European AI standardization in the context of the EU's AI Act. My name is Florian Ostmann. I'm the head of AI governance and regulatory innovation at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and AI, and I'm leading the Turing Institute's work on the AI Standards Hub. It's a pleasure to see so many of you joining us online today. We had a huge amount of interest in today's event, and I'm delighted that you decided to join us for this session and for what is said to be a very interesting and also very timely presentation and discussion. I will introduce our speaker and hand over to Sebastian Hallensleben in a moment, but I will take a couple of minutes to set the context for today's event and sort of to tell you a bit more about the motivation for today's session and also the context that it sits in terms of the AI Standards Hub's mission more broadly. European standardization for AI and the work of CEN-CENELEC in particular is a very timely topic. As many of you will be aware, the European Union's proposed AI Act has been under negotiation for quite a while now, and the new regulation will be applicable to any provider that is seeking to do business within the EU market. The proposed AI Act is also often compared to other pieces of EU regulation, such as the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, in terms of the impact that it may have and is likely to have on governance practices more broadly around the world in jurisdictions outside of the EU. That's a discussion that always or often takes place under the heading of the so-called Brussels effect of regulation being issued by the EU. Now, standards developed at the European level will play a key role in the implementation of the EU AI Act for reasons that we will hear more about during Sebastian's presentation in a moment. And the European Commission has recently issued its standardization request in relation to the AI Act, which tasks CEN-CENELEC with developing harmonized standards in support of the requirements of the EU AI Act. So as a result, these standards will be very influential. They will, among other things, act as a basis for declarations of conformity with requirements in the EU AI Act. And all of that background, all of that context makes today's topic a very important one and also a very timely one, given that the request for the development of harmonized standards has been issued recently, and this work is at a very early stage at the moment. It's at an early stage, but it's also set to evolve quite rapidly. And that's why we're delighted to have Sebastian Hallensleben with us today. I couldn't think of a better person, a better speaker to share with us what all of this entails in terms of the work that CEN-CENELEC is planning to pursue, given Sebastian's role as the chair of the Joint Technical Committee 21 between CEN-CENELEC, which is the committee that will be developing these standards. Now, that leads me to very briefly tell you a bit more about the mission of the AI Standards Hub, especially for those of you who for whom this may be the first event that you're participating in, just to give you a bit more context about what our initiative is trying to achieve and how today's event relates to that mission. The AI Standards Hub is a relatively young initiative. We launched in October last year, and it's an initiative that's based and rooted in the UK's national AI strategy. The mission at a high level is to advance responsible AI, specifically by thinking about the role that standards can play as a governance tool and as an enabler of AI innovation. And within that mission, there's a particular focus on empowering stakeholders to become more actively involved in AI standardization. And that includes participating in the development of standards and using standards once they have been published. Within that mission, once again, there is a focus on standards developed in international standards development organizations. And I'll say a bit more about what that means in a second. But CEN-CENELEC is one prominent example of two international standards development organizations. And so that's why this is a topic that sits squarely within the AI Standards Hub mission. Given that the development of standards in CEN-CENELEC is at an early stage, today's event also very closely really relates to our objective of enabling increased participation in the development of standards, because we're aware, of course, that understanding this fast-moving landscape, understanding what standards are being developed at the European level versus the international level, can be a complex challenge. And we hope that today's event will help those of you who are less familiar with the landscape to understand how the standards development process at the European level works, and also to understand how to get involved, how to what channels to use if you would like to contribute and make your voice heard in the development process for those standards. The general backbone for the AI Standards Hub that I wanted to briefly highlight, many of you will be aware of this already, is a new online platform that we developed that can be found at aistandardshub.org. That online platform provides a whole host of different types of resources that we hope will be helpful for anyone interested in the space of AI standardization. It includes databases that track relevant standards under development and published standards, also a database for policy and regulatory developments. It includes e-learning materials, and it includes discussion forums and under interactive features that are designed to help all of you interested in this topic to connect, to engage in community building and knowledge sharing. But having said that, the website is just the backbone, and an important part of the Standards Hub's work takes the form of live events such as today's event, workshops, webinars. We had a number of webinars and workshops already. If you're interested in those and weren't able to participate, you will be able to find the recordings of those in the event section on our website. And today's webinar is another important milestone in our program of live events. Very briefly, a few words about the Standards Development Organization landscape for those of you who may be less familiar with this landscape. And I'll keep this quite brief because Sebastian will go into more detail on some of this. But it's worth briefly mentioning at the outset, for those of you less familiar, that there are essentially three levels of standards development organizations that can be distinguished that are relevant to today's discussion. There's the national level, the level of national standards bodies or standards development organizations that operate nationally. There is the regional level, which in this context means the European level. And then there's the international level, by which we mean organizations whose mission is to develop standards that are meant to apply or to be used globally across regions. Now, it's a very wide-ranging landscape. The slide here doesn't capture the full landscape. It's merely meant to highlight the elements that are most relevant to today's discussion. And that includes at the regional level, the three European standards organizations, that's CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI. At the international level, two organizations worth highlighting are ISO and IEC. And at the national level in the UK, there is the British Standards Institution, which is the UK's national standards body. Now, what's worth highlighting at the outset, especially with the view of understanding of how to become involved in the development of European standards, is the fact that when it comes to CEN, CENELEC, and ISO and IEC, the British Standards Institution acts as the representative body for the UK in those organizations. What that means in practice is that BSI has a mirror committee for artificial intelligence. It's called ART1. And the role of that mirror committee is to follow the work that is happening in CEN-CENELEC and ISO IEC with regards to AI, and to then feed into that work at the CEN-CENELEC level and at the ISO IEC level. That work at the CEN-CENELEC level takes place in Joint Technical Committee 21, which Sebastian will tell us more about in a moment. At the ISO IEC level, it takes place in Joint Technical Committee 1 within ISO IEC and Subcommittee 42 for Artificial Intelligence. All of that may sound fairly complicated, but the most important takeaway from all of this is that the way to become formally involved in the development of those standards, to feed into the development of those standards, is through BSI's Mirror Committee ART1. And you'll find more information on that committee on our website, and there'll be ways to reach out and contact us to find out more about how to participate. So I will stop here with this brief introduction, and without further ado, I'll hand over to Sebastian. Once again, a big thank you, Sebastian, for joining us today, for giving up your time to present to us. By way of introduction, Sebastian Halsleben is, as I mentioned, the chair of JTC21 within CEN-CENELEC. That's the committee that has been tasked with developing the European standards for AI. Sebastian also has a wide range of other important roles at the international level. He's the chair of the Trusted Information Working Group within the EU's STAND ICT program. He co-chairs the AI risk management work at the OECD, and he also has roles in AI committees at the Council of Europe and at UNESCO. Sebastian heads the digitalization and AI work at VDE, which is the Association for Electronic and Information Technologies, which I'm sure he'll tell us more about in a moment. And there he is responsible for new product and service development, as well as for giving advice and developing frameworks for the German Parliament and federal ministries. So without further ado, thank you again, Sebastian, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Florian, for the kind introduction, and also for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to you and to provide you with an overview of the status, and maybe it's also some of the issues and challenges in AI standardization in Europe at the moment. I'll just share my screen. Right. So you should be seeing my screen. If not, please shout. So as Florian said, I carry many hats. The most relevant today is being the chair of CEN-CENELEC JTC21. I'm affiliated with VDE. It is an old organization, so that's not a typo on the slide, 1893. It is 130 years old, and it was created at a time when electricity was the new and exciting, but also dangerous technology. And there were challenges with pushing forward innovation, making sure that the approaches of different large companies were interoperable to open up new markets, to enable innovation. But there were also challenges around societal acceptance and about safety and about training and competency building. So in many ways, what we see for digital technologies such as AI today is a repetition of the kind of situation that prompted the creation of VDE in the first place 130 years ago. I'd like to pick up pretty much exactly where Florian left off just now, and that is the structure of standardization. And this is standardization in a strict sense that has very well-defined structures, very well-defined processes. I'll touch on other forms of standardization a little bit later on, but for now, this is the universe that we're looking at. We have three pillars: the overall standardization. We have a specific pillar for electrotechnical and IT standardization, and a pillar for telecommunication standardization. And those pillars really go from the international level with ISO, IEC, and ITU, through the European level with CEN-CENELEC and ETSI, all the way down to the national level. In the UK, you have one organization, BSI, that covers all three pillars. In Germany, we have got two organizations. The ISO pillar is covered by DIN, and the IEC and ITU pillars are covered by VDE DKE. And there are also countries where you have three national or more national organizations. But for now, that is a rough structure. And as Florian already pointed out, the role of those national committees is to accompany, to comment, to provide input to the European and international levels. So for AI, it's not really obvious which pillar AI belongs into. And therefore, the organizations involved have created joint structures to a large extent. So at the international level, we do have a joint technical committee, subcommittee 42 between ISO and IEC. At the European level, we have JTC21 between CEN and CENELEC. And at the national level, given the situation in Germany, we have also a joint committee. And we also have activities around standardization that feed into standardization. In Germany, it's a roadmap. And I think it's fair to say that in the UK, the new AI Standards Hub is playing much of that role. We do have a very special situation at the European level because we don't just have a formalized structure for European standardization organizations, but we also have a formalized relationship between standardization and regulation. And this connection, this synergy between standardization and regulation is captured in the so-called new legislative framework, which is a misnomer because it's not new. It dates back to the 1980s, but it's still called the new approach or new legislative framework. And it has stood the test of time and is something that works quite well. And I'll spend the next few minutes going into a little bit more detail what it actually means and how those two things play together. And of course, the key bit of regulation that we're talking about is the AI Act that is currently under negotiation between the European Commission, the European Parliament, and also the EU government, trying to find common ground. And there's a whole ecosystem of discussions and consensus building going on, although the overall direction of the Act and the overall approach of the Act seem to be pretty stable. So what does that relationship, what does that new legislative framework actually entail? Well, on a formal level, the answer is easy, and don't worry, I won't dive into depth on this. It's a bundle of regulations and decisions that make up the legislative framework. But for us, more important, we need to look at the conceptual structure of it. And I'd like to focus on the top half here that is highlighted. And this is actually the way in which the European Commission presents this topic as well. So the fundamental principle is a division of labor between regulation and standardization. Regulation covers the so-called essential requirements. You could also say it covers the objectives that are designed to ensure protection of public interests. So they define objectives, results, outcomes that are to be obtained, and in some cases also the risks or the hazards that should be dealt with. And if you look in the AI Act, it specifies things like, yeah, AI systems need to be transparent, they need to be auditable, they need to be explainable, but it doesn't really say how that should be achieved. Because the how, that's the realm of standards, and specifically harmonized standards that are detailing one possible technical solution to meet those essential requirements. It's not necessarily the only one, and it's not even mandatory to follow those standards. They are voluntary, but if you follow the standards, there is a so-called presumption of conformity. So there is an automatic assumption that you are also in compliance with the AI Act. So to pick up the example of transparency, suppose in the future there'll be a harmonized standard describing how to measure transparency and how to achieve transparency from a technical perspective. Then you don't have to follow the standard. You can make your AI systems or products transparent in other ways. But if you do follow the standard, there is a presumption, yes, you're also in line with the AI Act. If you don't follow the standard, you're allowed to do so, but then you have to prove yourself that you're still meeting the transparency requirement of the AI Act. So that is the basic division of labor between regulation and standardization. Now, there's a very big assumption in here, and that is an assumption that there are standards available for the big pieces of regulation, because otherwise the regulation is sort of hanging in the air if there are no standards underpinning it and describing how to implement it. And to close such gaps, there is a mechanism in the legislative framework called a standardization request. And a standardization request is essentially a shopping list. It's an order. It's a kind of a request that the European Commission issues to the European standardization organizations, and that literally contains items that standards are going to be needed for. And this is an extract from the recent standardization request to go with the AI Act. So the European Commission asks for standards for a risk management system, for governance and quality of data sets, for record keeping and logging, for transparency and information provision, for human oversight, for accuracy, for robustness, for cybersecurity, for quality management, and also for conformity assessment. And those of you who are roughly familiar with the AI Act will recognize that this is more or less covering all the essential requirements within the AI Act and rephrasing them as requests. And the level of details of that request doesn't go much further than that. There are a few, 2 or 3 explanatory sentences for each of those 10 items, but that's it. The rest is the responsibility of the European standardization community. And therefore, it is also the biggest task of JTC21, the European Committee under CEN-CENELEC. It's the biggest, one of the biggest committees ever, maybe the biggest committee ever. Right now, we are at 130 participants from 23 countries, and we're under a fairly tight deadline. Because if the AI Act proceeds through the political process as we expect it to proceed, and gets finalized later this year, followed by roughly 2 years of a grace period, implementation period, we've only got around 2 years to create the standards so that the standards are ready well in time for the AI Act to actually take effect. So in standardization terms, that's a blink of an eye. 2 years is a very, very tight deadline. And so JTC21 has a very straightforward mission that is geared towards this major purpose. So it is to create standardization deliverables for AI and also its use of related data, highlighting the prominence of training data, to consider the adoption of international standards relevant to Europe. This is phrased quite carefully because, of course, if there are international standards that cover European needs, there's no point reinventing the wheel and doing European ones. So all the international standards need to be looked at to say, well, can we use them for Europe? Do they maybe cover part of the standardization request already? If so, great. There's a mechanism for wrapping a blue flag with a yellow ribbon around it and turn it into a harmonized standard for European purposes. In some cases, some amendments and additions will be required. And the hope is that a good chunk of European needs can be covered by international standards. Otherwise, we haven't got a chance to meet that deadline. And finally, the mission of JTC21 is to address both European market needs and European societal needs. And that really reflects the specific European approach to AI that tries to combine both promotion of innovation, growth of markets on one hand, but also protection for fundamental rights, consideration of societal needs on the other side. So this really carries over from the political arena into standardization. So what does it actually mean? How are we arriving at our work program within JTC21? How are we responding to that in practical terms? Well, first of all, there's a very systematic approach. So there's a systematic review of European standardization needs. And of course, the request and the AI Act are big inputs to that, but maybe not the only inputs. There's a review of existing work, wherever it might be happening, and a gap analysis leading to potential activities for JTC21. But this is actually not the most typical way in which standardization works. In many other technical committees, and in particular where there is no regulation on its way, it's not a top-down approach, it's actually a bottom-up approach where individual experts, national committees, ad hoc groups realize specific standardization needs on a specific topic where there is not enough existing work and therefore potential for a JTC21 activity. And many of the discussions in over the last few months, have revolved around how do we bring together the top-down perspective and the bottom-up perspective into a coherent set of work item proposals, of new work item proposals that can then be balloted by the national bodies, including BSI Art 1, and be turned into active live work items. And that's not a one-off process. That's something that can repeat itself again and again. And work is well underway. That's the most recent plenary meeting. The UK delegation is just above the center. And you can see Adam Leon Smith here. So that's the UK delegation. But all the other delegations come together as well. And as I said, it's one of the biggest committees ever. And we had a hybrid event. So we had roughly the same number of people again joining online. And we have a fairly big work program. I'm not going to walk through all of those items in detail, don't worry, just to give you a flavor of the inside of how the nuts and bolts of standardization in JTC21 work. So we've organized our work in 3 working groups, one for operational aspects, one for engineering aspects, and one for foundational and societal aspects. You can also see how those work items are allocated to those groups, and all the ones highlighted in blue, they are work items that are the potential adoption of international work. So where there is no need, probably, to create specific European standards, but where we can adopt international standards, typically from ISO/IEC, and either adopt them directly, for example, in the case of terminology, that's a very likely approach, or adopt them with some modifications and amendments. And all the yellow ones, they are standards that are specific to Europe and that will be developed from scratch in Europe. So unsurprisingly, standards around AI trustworthiness are in there because there are specific European concerns. Also standards or standardization work around AI conformity assessment, because that is very tightly linked to structures of conformity assessments that are specific to European jurisdictions. And finally, last but not least, there is also kind of a middle ground, best of both worlds in some cases, highlighted in green here, where European and international level try to work in parallel to come up with a standard that satisfies European needs, but is also acceptable to the broader range of countries active at the international level. So moving on from this nuts and bolts insight into what is actually happening in JTC21 to some of the challenges and issues around AI standardization, in particular, because it has such a high profile and a high impact as an almost, not quite, but almost integral part of European regulation. So the first challenge, it's a question that is asked quite often, is legitimacy. So if harmonized standards are so important, not mandatory, but still very, very important, where do they take their legitimacy from? And there is, of course, a strong answer in that standardization is consensus-based. It's not a majority decision. And also, standardization has an obligation to bring in all relevant stakeholders. And that phrase is taken quite seriously. So as the chair of JTC21, together with the other, with the management team, I have an obligation to bring in all relevant stakeholders. So all the types of groups and people, organizations that are affected or going to be affected by those standards. This is not just industry, it's also civil society, it's academia, it could be trade unions, it could be other groups as well. So as the management team, we have to find a way to make sure that all relevant stakeholders are around the table and can influence and provide input. And consensus building covers all relevant stakeholders. So that, for example, means that representatives from civil society or from consumer associations, they can have a strong voice and make sure that that consensus reflects their needs as well, rather than only industry needs. But even within industry, there is a big difference in the interests between large companies versus small companies, AI manufacturers versus AI operators, European companies versus international companies, and so on. So even there, we have to make sure that all the voices, all the types of voices are around the table, and we build consensus with all of them. That's also the reason why standardization is slow, but that is a big source of legitimacy. Tiny wrinkle to it at the European level, there are also the so-called Annex 3 organizations. So there are some organizations that are guaranteed a direct seat at the table without having to go through national bodies. And consumers concerns, trade union concerns, and small business concerns are particularly relevant for JTC21. So that is the theory, and that is all true, but there is a challenge in practice, because to take part in these discussions and in the work towards standards, you need time, you need specialist knowledge, and you also need process knowledge, how standardization actually works. And this is not equally distributed. So you might have representatives from, for example, different sectors, and some of them know very little about AI, but everything about standardization processes, and others know everything about AI, but haven't got the faintest idea how standardization works and what a new work item proposal or a Form 4 is. And also, some have got a lot of time because it's their main job to contribute to standardization, and some do it on the side, more or less in their spare time. And so there are major disparities. And again, one of the roles that the management team, including myself, has is to try and balance that out to some extent as far as possible. The next thorny issue is European sovereignty. So if you take global companies, regardless who you're thinking of, the big internet companies in particular, regardless from the US, from China, from wherever else, they are, of course, involved. They need to be involved in creating European standards because they're active in Europe. They have got a lot of business, a lot of users in Europe. But at the same time, it raises question marks that global companies with headquarters and the kind of center of power elsewhere shape European standards, given that they are so close to European regulation. There's also the broader issue of standardization as a geopolitical instrument or a geopolitical issue. That's in particular true in relation to China. Right now, this plays out a lot between the US and China, but Europe is sort of somewhere caught in the middle. And sometimes those issues creep in. And also, it's easy to say, well, we want European sovereignty, but that also requires having enough knowledge and enough technology leadership. Whoever drives technology in a given field historically also drives standardization, not in a formal way, but simply because whoever drives the technology has got the people, has got the knowledge, has got the insight, what is important to standardize, and therefore drive standardization. If those entities are outside of Europe, it's very hard to claim European sovereignty. So the statement by the European Commission in their standardization strategy issued a month ago is a clear overall goal, but there are some wrinkles in the way that it can be implemented. And related to that, and this is a question that is quite pertinent to AI standardization, what is actually Europe? So given that we've got a UK audience today, it starts with the set of EU countries being different from the set of countries in CEN-CENELEC. CEN-CENELEC covers 30 countries, the EU covers 27 countries, and the UK is no longer in the EU. So we have the strange situation that experts from the UK are being asked to spend their time to influence legislation that doesn't really affect them. Or you can phrase it the other way around. You can say, well, UK actors are influencing legislation in another jurisdiction. So there are some tricky issues around that that typically in day-to-day practice are not a problem because we all work together very, very well. But on a broader level, at the CEN-CENELEC level, that has led to some discussions. And as far as AI is concerned, it's quite hard to define what is European AI. So you might have a server that sits in France, is operated by a UK company. The algorithm came from Silicon Valley, data came from China, and the people affected by the decisions of the AI systems sit in Switzerland. And then you're trying to answer the question, well, is that European AI? Yes or no? So this is actually quite hard and not really properly resolved yet. And then finally, within AI, we do have a large number of companies that have some sort of monopoly or near monopoly position. And for those companies, the question, are we interested in standards, is sometimes a little bit hard to answer, because you could argue, well, we are a monopoly or almost monopoly already. We have a de facto standard. Why should we talk to other entities and other organizations? And so the benefits of a good standard, interoperability, enforceability, testability, aren't necessarily in everyone's interest, and it sometimes creates extra steps that are necessary in consensus building. So that takes us to the question, what actually makes good European AI standards? What's the metric that we give ourselves? Well, I've already mentioned one very important one, no reinventing the wheel. So if there are international standards, in particular ISO IEC standards, we reuse those as far as possible. Also, standards need to be actionable and operationalizable. They have to be designed so that they can be put into practice, that I can use them to improve something, to measure something, to test something. It's not enough just to have kind of a best practice guide. It needs to go further with that. It also needs to be coherent with other standards and frameworks. I was mentioning earlier, there is a much bigger universe of activities that are either creating standards or in standards-like activities. So that's the Council of Europe that is creating a framework in the Committee on AI that is in particular relevant for public administration's use of AI. There are entities like the Big Data Valley Association or Gaia-X. They don't call themselves standardizers, but they create interface specifications architectures that, for all intents and purposes, play a similar role to standards. So want to be consistent with those. There are big entities such as IEEE with their own standardization activities, and in particular the P7000 series for AI trustworthiness, and a few other organizations, and I'll give special mention to the OECD in a moment. Good European standards also require that we have a horizontal approach, yes, so a sector-independent approach as far as possible. That's the same way that the AI Act is being constructed, but to also consider vertical standardization, specifics for the automotive sector, specifics for the health sector, specifics for cybersecurity, and so on. So that integration with vertical standardization, or that compatibility with vertical standardization, is also a success criteria. And then, of course, to satisfy European specificities and requirements. And I'd like to conclude with a picture here that is identical to the picture I showed earlier, with one exception in the top left here. You might have wondered earlier, when I was talking about that special relationship between standardization and regulation at the European level, is there something similar at the international level? Is there, I don't know, some United Nations entity here, some relationship between the United Nations and ISO, IEC, and ITU? The quick answer there is no, because we don't have regulation in a worldwide sense. But the slightly more detailed answer is that the OECD is playing, in some respects, that role. So the OECD is not just an organization that publishes statistics on the economy. That's probably what it is most well known for. But the OECD actually also has a number of binding instruments that bind the roughly 50 countries that are inside OECD. And one of those binding frameworks are the so-called due diligence guidelines, DDG, for responsible business conduct that bind multinational enterprises. Right now, those guidelines are around 10 years old, and they create things like don't pay bribes to officials in other countries, don't destroy the environment, don't use child labor, a few basics of responsible behavior like that. But the new iteration of those guidelines for responsible business conduct will also contain a chapter on AI, and in particular on AI risk management and or the governance of AI risks. And here, the analogy is sort of starting to make sense. So the OECD guidelines will formulate overall objectives or overall steps that need to be taken by an organization for proper AI risk management. But it doesn't specify the details. What it will specify is it'll point to various existing frameworks. So it might point to work of ISO, IEC, and ITU. It might also point, for example, to the NIST risk management framework and the ISO 31000, the IEC Guide 51, and so on and so forth. So it won't be a kind of a direct correspondence, but it will be constructed as a set of references to standards and standard-like frameworks that could be used to satisfy certain elements of the responsible business conduct guidelines. And with that, I'd like to conclude my talk. And I'm curious, we've got just under a quarter of an hour left. I'm curious about your questions. I see there's already been very active participation in the chat, but I'm quite curious to hear about and see in a moment. But for the time being, this is my overview, and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sebastian, for this really comprehensive and really valuable overview. There are quite a few questions that have come in, and to anyone watching, please keep on sharing your questions. We'll try to cover as many as we can in the time that remains. There was a first question around BSI representing the UK in CEN-CENELEC. I think that's been answered. So BSI, CEN-CENELEC membership isn't limited to national standards bodies of EU countries, and BSI is representing the UK in CEN-CENELEC. So I think we have answered that one. There were a couple of questions around certification and accreditation and notified bodies. Maybe we can take those together. So the first question from Adil: are notified bodies going to be involved in ensuring the conformity of systems implementing AI? And then there was a related question further down. Do you align with, and I take it that means the work in CEN-CENELEC, with accreditation bodies such as UCAS in the UK on the sets of criteria to be satisfied by future AI certification bodies to be accredited and developers of AI systems? If you do such alignment, how does it work in practice?
This is actually a very, very good question, and this is active work, or let's put it that way. The question is being asked inside JTC21 as well. So there is a work stream in preparation for the competencies of notified bodies, and I'm assuming that UCAS would kind of the UCAS question would fit into that context. So the issue has been put on the agenda, and it's live work yet, and I don't yet have a good answer to your question, but it'll come out of that work stream. And should I just have a quick browse through the list of questions?
Yes, yeah. I mean, we can take them in turn, perhaps, if you know, in the order in which they came in. So yeah, maybe a couple of questions, or maybe group them together by sort of similar themes. I think a couple of questions on the mechanics of the work in CEN-CENELEC, which may have quite a short answer. One question from Keith around: could you say a bit more about the role of ETSI in providing input to standards?
Good question.
And then maybe related to that, is the list of participants of JTC21 public, or is there any way of understanding who participates?
Okay, ETSI is an easy answer. There is a so-called Mode 4 cooperation between CEN-CENELEC JTC21 on one hand and ETSI on the other hand. Mode 4 means that all experts in ETSI can participate in JTC1 working groups and vice versa. So it's actually quite a strong statement. But ETSI doesn't have a vote. So it's joint work, but you can't vote in the other body. List of participants of JTC21 being public, that is a good question. I don't think it is, as far as I know. I'm less sure about the list of participants in the national committees. I have to pass on that question, actually. I'm not sure whether it's public or not, or whether there are some data protection issues that prevent it from being public.
Thank you. And there is information on at least the membership of the national committee available through the link that we shared in the chat earlier. So please take a look at that if you're interested in that aspect. I think there were quite a few questions around participation in the development of standards, especially around the inclusion of civil society voices and generally voices other than industry voices. So it'd be interesting if you could say a bit more. You mentioned already the Annex 3 organizations, but if you wouldn't mind going into a bit more detail perhaps on those and how you envisage also as a committee chair, making sure that all stakeholder voices are represented. That would be great.
So from a formal perspective, the answer is easy, because anyone can join their national committee, and from that national committee contribute to JTC21 and also to the international level. However, depending on the national committee, some have free membership, some charge for membership. And also, you obviously need to spend some of your time. And so there is a program by the European Union called StandICT. So it's standict.eu that tries to cover travel costs at least, and also covers kind of the time and effort. I think it's up to 20,000 euros per person, something like that. To kind of redress the balance a little bit and make it easier for academics and also civil society representatives to take part in standardization work.
Great, thank you very much for that. And we'll put the link to StandICT in the chat in a moment. Maybe relatedly, there was a question around challenges potentially to get involved through the national standards body. Christina raised a question, a challenge, I think in the Czech Republic, where the national standards body hasn't been very responsive. Are there any ways for, if someone finds themselves in a country where it doesn't seem to be easy, or there doesn't seem to be a lot of responsiveness in engaging with the national standards body, are there any other ways to feed into CEN-CENELEC's work?
That's a good question. I have tried in the past, whenever I come across representatives, political representatives of companies, of countries that haven't set up a national AI standardization committee, I'm leaning on them and say, well, you really should. And in some cases it has worked, but not in all cases. In particular, the Czech Republic is one example where we don't see any activity yet. My advice would be kind of on a formal level to contact the standardization organization directly, or maybe you have political channels as well to lobby for it. As far as I know, I'm not 100% sure. As far as I know, you could theoretically also contribute to the national committee of another country, but the rules might vary there. But you can't, unfortunately, contribute directly to JTC21. There's another, however, there, and a workaround. If you're specifically interested in, for example, consumer issues or trade union concerns, you could also consider contributing through ANEC, who have an automatic seat at the table as an Annex 3 organization, or through ETUC, who do the same for trade union concerns. So that might be another route to have your voice heard.
Great, thank you. Moving on, there were a couple of questions on timelines, and I realize all of that is still very much in flux, also with the development of the AI Act, but I think everyone's curious to get your take on it, sort of to the best of your knowledge. So the question, the first one, the EU AI Act is likely to have a shorter timeline for high-risk applications and may have to fulfill requirements already in the second quarter of 24. If the standards aren't available before the second quarter of 25, is this going to be a problem?
That would actually be news to me. So I think well, we have an excellent relationship with the European Commission. I should say that in advance. They take part in all our meetings. They are available for advice. They take advice a lot. So I'm relatively sure that I've got a complete picture of their expectation. And what we hear from there is the typical situation is that the AI Act gets finalized later this year. And then there's typically a 2-year grace period, which takes us into 2025. I wouldn't be aware of any more rapid enforcement for high-risk areas. I might be wrong, but it's the first time I hear about that, I have to admit.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, if it is true, I'm sure we will hear about it again. So yeah, and I think you answered the other question about the 2-year grace period as well. So thank you for that. There's a question around UN organizations, the ITU and the International Atomic Energy Association. Are you taking account of the work being done in those organizations?
Yes, we use anything we can get. Whenever there is something already there, regardless where it is, that we can use or adapt, then we try to. The practical limits are we have to know about it, and a lot of the times this is because there are people in JTC21 who are also active, say in ITU or in other international organizations, and say, hey, we're overlooking something useful here. Because we haven't got the resources to do a full formal analysis of every standardization activity on AI in the world. We haven't got the resources to do that, so we rely on members of JTC21 knowing about it. But apart from that, we use whatever can be used. There are sometimes IP issues, in particular with using work from IEEE. They are not a problem if we reference work, but if we want to kind of modify work or build on work, it can be an issue.
Great, thank you. There are lots of questions left, and I'm afraid we won't be able to cover all of them. And I'll maybe slightly break the order and just pick one last question on the grounds that I think it's a question that will be on the front of a lot of people's minds, namely a question about generative AI. The combined question, I suppose, to what extent does the EU AI Act have implications for generative AI, but also to what extent are you thinking about standardization work in relation to generative AI, such as ChatGPT, and what should companies be aware of in that space?
It's a very, very good question. And I do have a strong interest in generative AI, actually going back to 2019 when deepfakes came onto the scene. I'm also involved in pushing the OECD to take on a look at generative AI and how to respond to it from a policy perspective. So yes, I think it will play a role in standardization as well. Discussions, as far as I can tell, are not conclusive yet whether the current draft of the AI Act covers generative AI in sufficient detail. I think it warrants a closer look because all the previous thinking was very much geared towards AI as a kind of as a tool for decision making or decision support rather than as a tool for generating content or generating people. From my perspective, the jury is still out. What, if anything, needs to be optimized in the AI Act for that? And that will also travel across to standardization as well.
Thanks for that answer. And so that's a space to be watched. Generative AI, obviously a rapidly evolving field. I think we're unfortunately at the time mark. So thank you very much, Sebastian. This has been a great session. Thank you for giving up your time to share your insights with us. To all of you watching and listening, I hope you found this session helpful and interesting. And if you're lucky, it has also sort of spurred your interest to stay engaged with the AI Standards Hub's work more broadly. There are a few ways of doing that, of staying involved. We have our social media presence. Please follow us on Twitter if you're interested to stay in touch and up to date on our activities. Take a look at our online platform. In particular, if you haven't done yet, we'd like to invite you to create a user account on our website that will allow you to take advantage of all kinds of interactive features. We also have a separate email newsletter that we'd like to invite you to sign up for. And then, of course, there'll be upcoming events which we will announce on social media and through the newsletter. One final thing to mention, since we've run out of time to answer questions, I'd like to invite all those of you who didn't get a chance to get an answer to their question to repost that question in the online discussion thread that we have on the events page. I just posted a link to that in the chat. So this is the events page that you use to register for this webinar. At the bottom of the page, there is a discussion thread which currently doesn't have any posts. If you sign up for a user account, you'll be able to post into that thread. So please feel free to share your questions there, and we will make sure to answer any questions from our side insofar as we can in the coming days there. And also, any additional questions, any additional thoughts that you might have, it's really a space to keep the conversation going and sort of have a continued exchange of ideas on the topics that we discussed today. So with that, having said, thank you very much again, Sebastian. Thank you, all of you, for dialing in, for joining us today, and hopefully see you again soon at a future event. Thank you.
Thank you from my side as well.